One of the biggest questions in all of science has always been, how does life actually change? Today, we're going to dive into the story of the very first major answers to that question. We're looking at two giants of biology, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and Charles Darwin, and their clashing ideas about how evolution works. And really, it all kind of boils down to a simple, almost kid-like question. Why do giraffes have such crazy long necks? This classic puzzle became the perfect battleground for these early theories. So how would you explain it? Well, let's see how the pioneers of biology tried to tackle that exact problem. So, for literally centuries, thinkers and naturalists could see with their own eyes that species weren't just stuck. They found fossils that didn't match any living animals, and they saw how perfectly creatures seemed to fit into their environments. They knew that change was happening, but the how and the why of it all, that was a complete mystery. Okay, so let's set the scene here. The year is 1809. This is decades before Darwin would become a household name. A French naturalist steps up with a really bold theory, and he's aiming to solve this evolutionary puzzle once and for all. And that naturalist's name was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And look, his idea was, well, it was ingenious, it was elegant, and honestly, it made a whole lot of sense on the surface. He was one of the very first to seriously propose that species change over time, coming from less complex ancestors. But his explanation, as brilliant as it was for its time, turned out to be wrong. So Lamarck's whole theory really hinged on this one core concept, the inheritance of acquired traits. The idea was pretty straightforward. Anything an organism picks up or develops during its own lifetime, through effort or just by living in its environment, could be passed directly on to its kids. And of course, he used the perfect example, the giraffe. He's picturing this ancient giraffe, right? And it's stretching its neck every single day to reach those higher, tastier leaves. And through all that lifelong effort, its neck actually gets a little longer. Lamarck believed it would then pass that acquired longer neck onto its babies. And you just repeat that over and over for generations, and poof, you get the towering animal we know today. So what was the engine driving all this change? Well, for Lamarck, it was this principle he called use and disuse. It's just like it sounds. The parts of the body you use all the time get bigger and stronger, kind of like a blacksmith's arms, and the parts you don't use, they just shrink and fade away. This was the active mechanism that let an animal basically shape its own evolution. I mean, it sounds pretty logical, doesn't it? But hold on a second. Let's really think about this. If a bodybuilder spends their entire life in the gym and gets absolutely huge muscles, are their kids born with those same muscles? Or if someone, heaven forbid, loses a finger in an accident, is their baby born with only 9 fingers? All of a sudden, the theory starts to feel a little bit shaky. And this is where our story takes a really interesting turn, all thanks to a scientist named August Weismann. In the late 1800s, he decided to put Lamarck's big idea to the ultimate test with a very simple and, maybe a little gruesome experiment. You see, Weismann's experiment was just brilliantly simple. He took a bunch of mice and cut off their tails, a very clear acquired characteristic, right? Then he let them braid. What about their babies? All born with perfectly normal tails. So he did it again. He cut the tails off the next generation and the next. And after 5 whole generations, we're talking over 900 mice here, the result never ever changed. Every single mouse was born with a full-length tail. Yeah, this was pretty much the final nail in the coffin for Lamarck's big idea. Weismann's experiment proved, quite clearly, that changes to an organism's body during its lifetime just don't get passed down. The idea of inheriting acquired traits was officially off the table, and the great evolutionary puzzle was wide open all over again. So, with that idea disproven, who steps into the void? Well, none other than the man himself, Charles Darwin. He had spent decades traveling the globe just observing nature, and piece by piece, he was putting together a totally different explanation for how species change. It wasn't about effort or wanting to change, it was about a much more powerful, impersonal force. Okay, so Darwin's theory of natural selection really boils down to 4 key ideas. First up, overproduction. Basically, organisms just have way more kids than can possibly survive. Second, and this is so important, is genetic variation. Among all those kids, there are natural inherited differences. I mean, just think about you and your siblings. You're not identical copies, right? Third, there's competition. Because you have too many offspring and not enough food or space, they all have to compete to stay alive. And finally, that leads to differential reproduction. The individuals who just happen to be born with traits that give them an edge are more likely to survive, have kids of their own, and pass those specific winning traits on. All right, so now that we have this whole new framework in mind, let's circle all the way back to our original question. How does Darwin's theory explain that long giraffe neck? So let's put these two ideas right next to each other, head to head. For Lamarck, evolution was an active process. Giraffes stretched and strived to change. But for Darwin, it was a passive process of selection. He argued that in any group of giraffes, some were just born with slightly longer necks and others with slightly shorter necks. That's just natural variation. The ones who happened to be born with the longer necks had an advantage. They could eat more, so they were healthier, lived longer, and had more babies who also tended to have long necks. It wasn't about trying. It was about inheriting the lucky traits.
Now, Darwin's theory was absolutely revolutionary. Natural selection gave science the mechanism it had been desperately looking for. It explained so much, but, and this is a big but, there was this giant gaping hole right in the middle of his theory. One he was never, ever able to fill.
And this is maybe the most fascinating part of the whole story, because for all of his genius, Darwin knew there was something missing. His entire theory was built on one absolutely critical idea, and he had no clue where it came from. Okay, so Darwin knew, he absolutely knew that variation was the fuel for natural selection. It was the raw material. Without those little differences between each giraffe, for instance, selection would have nothing to select from. But he was totally stumped by the most basic question of all. Where did these variations come from in the first place? And the answer, if you look right here in these original notes, couldn't be clearer. Look at this. The question is right there. Did Darwin know the source of these variations? And the answer, circled in yellow for everyone to see, is a big, fat no. The simple, honest truth is Darwin had no concept of genetics. The incredible work of Gregor Mendel, the monk who basically founded the entire field of genetics, well, that was happening during Darwin's lifetime, but the two never connected. Darwin couldn't explain the source of variation because he didn't know about genes, mutations, or DNA. And that's really the final takeaway here, isn't it? Darwin gave us the incredible mechanism of natural selection, but the source of the very variations that fuel that engine remained a complete mystery in his time. It's just an amazing reminder that science is always a journey, a collaboration across generations. And even our biggest, most brilliant answers just reveal new puzzles waiting to be solved.